Nobody on that plane knew her name yet. In 11 minutes, they would wish they never learned it. She was sitting in seat 2A, wrists locked behind her back in a pair of cold metal cuffs, while 40 passengers sat frozen in their seats, phones raised, recording something none of them understood. A flight attendant stood in the aisle with her hand over her mouth. A man in seat 2B stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. And at the front of the cabin, an officer who thought he was doing his job stood with his arms crossed, completely unaware that in a few short minutes, his entire career would be sitting in the palm of the very woman he had just cuffed. This is the story of Vivian Marsh, a woman who never raised her voice, never made a scene, and never once told anyone in that cabin who she really was. Because she did not need to. The truth was going to find its own way out. If stories like this keep you hooked, go ahead and subscribe right now, because trust me, this one only gets more intense from here. Let us go back to the beginning, to the moment before anyone knew what was about to happen at 35,000 feet. It was a Tuesday morning at Denver International Airport, and the terminal moved the way it always did. Tired travelers pulling suitcases, with wheels that never rolled straight, gate agents calling out final boarding announcements, and the low hum of 100 conversations blending into noise. Vivian Marsh moved through all of it, without drawing a single glance. She wore a plain grey blazer, flat shoes, and carried nothing but a leather tote and a tablet. No entourage, no assistant trailing behind her with a coffee order. No sunglasses hiding her face. She looked like any other business traveler heading out for a Tuesday meeting, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Vivian had learned a long time ago that the less attention she drew, the more she could actually get done. She valued her privacy the way other people valued their titles, and after 2 decades of building her company, from a 2-person office into a logistics and technology firm operating in dozens of cities, she had earned the right to fly quietly, without anyone knowing exactly who was sitting among them. She scanned her boarding pass, walked down the jet bridge, and took her seat. 2A, a window seat in the first row, the same seat she requested on every flight, not because she needed the luxury, but because it was quiet, and quiet was something Vivian valued more than almost anything else in her life. She settled in, pulled out her tablet, and began reviewing a contract for a new distribution center opening in Ohio. She thanked the flight attendant by name when she was offered a pillow. Her name was Renee, and Vivian remembered it, because Vivian remembered almost everyone's name. It was a habit from her early years, back when she was the one being overlooked, back when nobody bothered to learn her name either. A few minutes later, a man walked down the aisle, phone pressed to his ear, voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. His name was Grant Ellison, and from the sound of his conversation, he was in the middle of finalizing some kind of real estate deal that was, according to him, about to fall apart, because someone on his team had missed a deadline. Grant took his seat in 2B, right beside Vivian, still talking, still irritated. When he finally ended his call, he glanced sideways at her, then down at his boarding pass, then back at her again. He did not say anything at first, but something about her presence beside him did not sit right with him, and it was clear from the way his jaw tightened that he had already made up his mind about something, long before he had any reason to. Before we get into the moment that changes everything, take a second and hit that subscribe button, because you are not going to want to miss how this unfolds. The plane finished boarding, and the doors closed. Passengers settled in for the flight, some closing their eyes, others scrolling through their phones one last time before switching to airplane mode. Grant, however, was still watching Vivian. He leaned toward the aisle and waved down Renee as she passed by with the safety demonstration cart. He asked her, quietly at first, whether she could double-check the seating chart, because he was, in his words, pretty sure there had been some kind of mix-up. Renee smiled politely and pulled up the manifest on her tablet. She confirmed that seat 2A belonged to Vivian Marsh, ticketed and paid for in full, first class, same as his own seat. Grant did not seem satisfied with that answer. He asked again, this time a little louder, whether Renee was sure, because something about the situation did not add up to him. Vivian did not look up from her tablet. She did not respond. She simply continued reading, as if she had heard this kind of thing before, and had long since decided it was not worth her energy. But Grant was not finished. He raised his voice slightly and said that he simply wanted to make sure everything was in order, given the value of his own ticket and the section they were sitting in. A few passengers nearby began to glance over. One woman across the aisle lowered her magazine to watch. Renee, doing her best to de-escalate the situation, gently reminded Grant that Vivian's ticket had already been verified and that there was nothing further to check. Grant folded his arms and muttered that something still felt off to him, that he had flown this route dozens of times and had never seen this kind of thing happen before. The tension in the cabin began to build. A young man 2 rows back quietly started recording on his phone, sensing that something uncomfortable was unfolding. Grant, now aware that people were watching, seemed to dig in even further. He told Renee that he wanted to speak to someone with more authority, because he did not feel comfortable continuing the flight until the situation was, in his words, properly addressed. Renee called for the lead flight attendant, a woman named Carol, who arrived at the row and once again confirmed that everything about Vivian's ticket, seating, and identification was completely in order. Still, Grant refused to let it go. He suggested, without any real basis, that there could be a security concern, and that perhaps it would be safer for everyone if the situation was reviewed more thoroughly before takeoff. Vivian finally looked up, not at Grant, at Renee, and with a calm, even voice, she said something that would later replay in the minds of everyone on that plane. She said quite simply that she understood and that she was happy to wait as long as it took for everyone to feel comfortable. She was not defending herself. She was not raising her voice. She was allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was going to unfold, almost as if she already knew where it was headed. Word was sent to the gate that a situation had developed on board, and that additional support was needed before departure. Within minutes, an off-duty officer, moonlighting in airport security, a man named Dale Kowalski, boarded the aircraft. Kowalski walked down the narrow aisle, and the entire cabin fell into an uneasy hush. Grant, visibly relieved that someone in a uniform had finally arrived, quickly explained his version of events, emphasizing that he simply wanted to be sure everything was safe before the flight continued. Kowalski approached row 2 and asked Vivian for her identification. She calmly reached into her tote, retrieved her identification and boarding pass, and handed them over without hesitation. Everything matched: her name, her seat, her ticket. There was nothing irregular about any of it. And yet, Kowalski hesitated only a moment before saying that given the concerns raised, he felt it would be best, purely as a precaution, to have Vivian step off the aircraft while the matter was reviewed further. Renee opened her mouth to object, but Kowalski had already made his decision. He asked Vivian to stand, and when she rose from her seat without protest, he took out a pair of handcuffs and secured her wrists behind her back. The cabin went completely silent. Not a single phone stopped recording. Vivian did not resist. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry out or demand an explanation. She simply turned her head slightly toward Kowalski, and in a voice so calm, it almost unsettled him more than if she had screamed, she said one sentence. She told him that before this was over, he might want to think very carefully about who actually signs his paycheck. Nobody in that cabin understood what she meant. Not Kowalski, not Grant, not even Renee. The words hung in the air for a moment, strange and out of place, before Kowalski gently guided her toward the front of the plane and off the aircraft, cuffs still in place, 40 strangers watching in stunned silence as the quiet woman from seat 2A disappeared through the cabin door. At the gate counter, a young agent named Priya was asked to pull up the passenger manifest to begin filing the incident report. It was routine paperwork, the kind she had done 100 times before. She typed in the seat number, pulled up the passenger record, and glanced at the full legal name listed beside it: Vivian Renata Marsh. Priya froze. She recognized the name immediately, not from the flight, but from a briefing her regional manager had circulated only weeks earlier, regarding a major new vendor contract the airport had just signed. The contract covered ground security staffing at 3 terminals, including the one they were standing in, and the company that had won that contract, the company that now employed every officer working security at that airport, including Dale Kowalski, was a logistics and technology firm called Marsh Dynamics. Vivian Marsh was not simply a passenger. She was the founder and chief executive officer of the very company that now, indirectly, paid Officer Kowalski's salary. Priya picked up the phone with shaking hands and called her supervisor, who immediately called the airline's corporate liaison. Within minutes, a small chain reaction of phone calls was moving faster than anyone on that plane could have imagined, each person realizing the same horrifying truth a little further up the chain of command. The corporate liaison, a man named Ferris Doyle, grabbed his badge and ran toward the gate, praying the aircraft had not yet pushed back from the terminal. Now let me ask you something before we go any further. If you were Officer Kowalski right now, standing at that gate with no idea what was coming, would you want someone to warn you before the truth came out? Or do you think a moment like this only means something if he has to face it live, in front of everyone? Type your answer in the comments, because I am curious how many of you would want the warning, and how many of you think he deserves to be surprised. Captain Tom Hargrove had already begun taxiing toward the runway when the call came through from ground operations. He listened carefully as the details were relayed to him: the vendor contract, the name on the manifest, the cuffs already in place. Hargrove had spent 19 years flying commercial aircraft, and in that time, he had learned that very few problems solve themselves by simply moving forward. Turning the aircraft around meant a delay. It meant paperwork, questions from headquarters, and an uncomfortable conversation with every passenger on board. But continuing forward, knowing what he now knew, was not something he was willing to do. He radioed ground control and requested clearance to return to the gate. The passengers felt the plane slow and begin to turn, and a quiet murmur moved through the cabin as everyone wondered what was happening now. Hargrove made a brief announcement over the intercom, calm and measured, explaining only that the flight would be returning to the gate briefly, to resolve an issue that had come up, and that he appreciated everyone's patience. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward the front of the plane. Renee stood near the galley, arms crossed, saying nothing, though anyone paying close attention could see the tension building behind her eyes. The aircraft pulled back up to the gate, and the door opened once again. Kowalski stood just outside, Vivian beside him, still cuffed, waiting for instructions on what came next. Ferris Doyle arrived, out of breath, and pulled Kowalski aside for a brief, urgent conversation. From where the passengers sat, they could see Kowalski's expression change in real time. His shoulders dropped. His face lost its color. He glanced back through the open cabin door toward Vivian, and for the first time since he had boarded that aircraft, he looked genuinely afraid. He walked back down the aisle, slower this time, and stopped in front of Vivian. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his key, and unlocked the cuffs himself, right there in front of every single passenger who had watched him put them on only minutes earlier. He began to apologize, stumbling over his words, explaining that he had not known who she was, that he was simply following the concerns that had been raised to him. Vivian rubbed her wrists gently, looked at him without any anger in her expression, and said only that she understood he was doing what he believed was his job. Then she turned to Renee, and in the same calm voice she had used throughout the entire ordeal, she simply asked if it might be possible to get her coffee refreshed before takeoff. Grant, sitting only a few feet away, had gone completely pale. He understood now exactly what had happened and exactly what role he had played in it. The other passengers, many of whom had been recording the entire incident, slowly began to piece it together as well. The cabin, once tense and hushed, now shifted into something else entirely. Passengers who had stayed quiet during the accusation suddenly found their voices. The woman across the aisle, who had lowered her magazine earlier, spoke up and said she had seen the entire thing unfold, and that Grant had pushed the situation from the very beginning with no real reason at all. Renee, standing near the front of the cabin, finally spoke as well. She confirmed, calmly and clearly, that Vivian's ticket had been verified from the very first request, and that everything that followed had been driven entirely by Grant's insistence, not by any actual concern from the crew. Grant tried to defend himself, saying that he had simply been looking out for the safety of the flight, that anyone in his position might have done the same thing, but nobody in that cabin was buying it anymore. The recordings on multiple phones told a very different story than the one he was now trying to tell. Ferris Doyle, still standing near the front of the plane, made the decision that Grant would need to be removed from the flight so that the matter could be reviewed properly on the ground. Grant stood, gathered his bag, and began making his way toward the exit, his face burning with the realization of what he had done. As he passed by row 2, Vivian looked up at him one final time. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She simply said that she hoped the next time he felt the urge to question where someone belonged, he would take a moment to check the facts before he checked the seat number. Grant said nothing in response. He simply nodded and walked off the plane, leaving behind a cabin full of passengers who would likely never forget what they had just witnessed. The flight eventually departed, nearly an hour behind schedule, but this time in complete silence. The kind of silence that comes not from tension, but from reflection. In the days that followed, the airline issued a public statement acknowledging the incident and apologizing directly to Vivian Marsh. Officer Kowalski's training procedures were formally reviewed, along with the broader protocol for handling passenger disputes without proper verification. Vivian, true to her nature, declined every interview request that came her way. She did not post about the incident. She did not comment publicly. She simply returned to her office the following Monday and continued reviewing contracts, the same way she always had. Because for Vivian Marsh, this was never about proving a point. It was never about power or status or being seen. It was about the simple truth that dignity does not need to be loud in order to be real, and that the people who try hardest to diminish others are often the ones who end up revealing the most about themselves. If this story affected you the way it affected me while writing it, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because we post stories exactly like this one every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next.